This conference seeks to change the situation of justice denied, foregrounding the voices of survivors, survivor advocacy, and survivor-informed research. We want to highlight the situations and the experiences from the Indo-Pacific region that are underappreciated in the global agenda. Tolerating conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence and denying justice to survivors holds back peace and prosperity in our region.
There is no continent and no country at war where lives of women and girls in particular have not been either irrevocably changed or entirely destroyed by war rape. It is a brutal assault on individuals, a weapon of war wielded to terrorize communities, and a profound stain on the conscience of the international community. For years it was treated as an unfortunate side effect of war, regrettable, but somehow inevitable. That was a catastrophic failure. Sexual violence is not incidental to conflict. It is a deliberate strategy, one designed to degrade, humiliate, and destroy. Only in recent decades has the world begun to confront this reality with the seriousness it demands.
But first, what progress have we made in fighting conflict-related sexual violence this last 25 years? To be honest, it's hard to say if we've actually put a dent in it. We read with daily horror in the news about ongoing violence in Darfur, Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, Myanmar, Afghanistan, Palestine, and Ukraine, crises in which gender-based violence in some form or another runs rampant still. Quantifying either overall incidence or prevalence of this form of violence is complicated, primarily because of the constant challenge and understandable challenge of underreporting, but also because assessing any increase or decrease requires first that we have a baseline measurement, and we just don't have a good one, to be honest. And not everyone is measuring the same thing, so it can be difficult to aggregate quantitative claims about conflict-related sexual violence at a global level.
Connecting the local to the regional to the global is really, really important, because we can talk about these kinds of things here, but in my experience in my country, we have these women who are facing violence at this very local level. And again, the holding accountability and justice may not be the key thing for them. They just want the violence to stop.
Many of the global South countries struggle with post-colonial inequalities, making WPS implementation harder. Drawing from indigenous and decolonial perspectives, we know that indigenous women and marginalized and minoritized women, they face double marginalization from colonial structures and also from gender-based oppression. They bring the discussions of land and sovereignty, talking about how colonialism led to forced displacement and environmental destruction. They talk about cultural survival, how the resistance, women's resistance, actually also draws from revitalization of languages, traditions, and local governance systems. Yet some of this work is missing when we are talking about women, peace, and security framework.
And access to justice system is weak there. Although that we have been really responsive mechanisms there, but then when it comes to the justice, what we call it's really the gender responsive justice. So it is not really there.
There are many obstacles in getting accountability in Sri Lanka. One is that we don't have the legal framework that recognizes conflict-related sexual violence.
There were records that show 45% of the conflict-affected areas had incidents of sexual violence. And yet you can't see comprehensive data on the scale of the abuse. And beyond just physical violence, CRSV is also about structural and indirect harms that continue long after the guns have fallen silent.
So it's very important that if we talk about the victims and survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, we should talk about all survivors, all victims of conflict-related sexual violence, even if it's stigma or taboo in your society.
the most vulnerable people is under 5 years old, also facing this kind of the sexual violence case happen to over 60 years. So that's why the women, where is our safety place? Even though in the IDP camp and refugee camp, this kind of the gender-based violence case is increasing. So it is very clear that there is no justice. No one are interested to solve the problem and taking the action on that.
Reparations as a right of survivors is crucial to address and repair the harm survivors have suffered. A survivor-centered, rights-based reparation process goes beyond financial, material, or physical repair. It helps restore the survivor's dignity and autonomy.
It is really, really deeply intertwined with tribal issues, with tribal conflicts, with resources sharing of benefits, and with the political instability in our country.
And we work with, especially with the women whose husbands were killed, disappeared, and the women who faced sexual violence, conflict-related sexual violence at the time of armed conflict.
CRSV is often associated with foreign wars in distant conflicts. But here, on this continent, sexual violence was used as a deliberate tool of colonization. It was wielded to dominate, dispossess, subjugate, and ethnically cleanse our people, attempting to break our cultural and spiritual strength. However, this conflict-related violence has evolved, and from an explicit, overt weapon to one that is now embedded in the very systems that structure our lives. It is structural, systemic, and gendered.
You don't become a man by being strong, you become a man by being safe. The violence did not begin with me, and it did not end with me. It began with colonization of this land, where rape, trafficking, and murder of Aboriginal women and girls was strategy, not collateral. It was recorded without consequence. It was normalized through law, and it continues to shape the lives of First Nations women today.
Survivor-centered approaches are not optional, and even if they slow processes, they build credibility, they ensure genuine access, and they support both immediate responses and long-term accountability. Even where those services exist, it doesn't necessarily mean they're accessible. If they exclude persons with disabilities, if they exclude LGBTQI plus communities, if they exclude certain cultural, ethnic, and religious groups, if they don't operate in local languages, if they compromise confidentiality, if they cannot be trusted, then they are not accessible.
How does one go about creating that space for documentation so that the evidence gathering is taking place in a credible, in a very detailed manner, but at the same time in a survivor-centric way? It can be very difficult to collect evidence in real time in a situation where access to territory where the human rights violations have taken place is not possible, a context like Myanmar. But what we have seen could be really helpful is to build the capacity of the grassroots level documenters to be able to document in a credible way.
But the reality is that safe and effective work with conflict-related sexual violence survivors cannot and should not be rushed. Well, the MORAD Code has been a really useful instrument to ensure that we take what is a survivor-centered trauma-informed approach and translate it into operational instructions and practice on the ground.
The level of CRSV actually dropped both by rebel forces and by STEP forces. So that means that we actually had tools here that we can create the space for working with survival-centered approaches and agency in a context where the peacekeeping can at least try to provide that kind of theatre.
I think critical is understanding and allowing the people who experience sexual exploitation and abuse to articulate it in their own terms and to respond on those terms, not to overlay narratives or labels that don't fit.
For me, as an advocate for peace and security, thinking about the gender role and the impact on that and what it means to the survivor, that makes justice really elusive and out of reach.
Without the meaningful inclusion of Rohingya voices, especially those of women, in any process, Burma will never achieve true democracy.
Creating space for them to tell their story and allow them to express their grievances is part of giving them justice.